Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to the first of our exciting programme of Innovise virtual events for 2021. My name is Ben Hutchins and I'm part of the marketing team here at Innovise. Today we are focusing on identifying the value of retrofitting SuDS in urban landscapes. We will also answer questions towards the end of our webinar. So if you have questions, please type them into the question box located in the right corner of your GoToWebinar interface. We won't mention your full name when reading your questions, and our experts will provide answers. Please note that all phone lines will be muted during the webinar. Now let me introduce you to your experts. Firstly, we are proud to welcome as our special guest today, Simon Ainley, Principal Drainage Engineer at Arcadis. Simon specialises in the development of sustainable drainage system planning strategies, utilising innovative hydraulic modelling techniques and multidisciplinary experience. His technical capabilities and experience also cover hydraulic network modelling, drainage design, geospatial analytics, risk assessment and benefit cost analysis. Simon was an early adopter of integrated modelling platforms within Arcadis, using the technology to explore more effective and practical techniques to understand drainage within the built environment. His passion for SuDS is catalysed by the ongoing challenges faced in the water sector around climate change, funding gaps and continued urbanisation. Joining Simon as your host today is Peter Coombs. Peter is Innovation Manager at Innovise. He is a Chartered Water and Environment Manager with 44 years of experience, starting as a civil engineer in the main drainage department for Thames Borough Council, covering all aspects of drainage. He has designed, modelled and delivered a range of storm and foul water networks in the UK before moving to the Middle East for 5 years. For the past 18 years, Peter has been with the Innovise Group, specialising in SuDS, floods, asset management and AI across the EMEA region. That completes our expert lineup for you today, so let's start the show. Peter, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Ben. Welcome, everybody, and I hope you had a great break over the Christmas period and wish you all well for 2021. The whole legacy that we're dealing with right now is really where we're at today with Simon. So thanks very much, Simon, for joining us and presenting on the retrofitting of SuDS. And this is where the real growth is going to come from. This is where we're going to gain the most benefits. We're improving the legislation and the standards on new design of SuDS, but it's really the legacy that we've got to overcome, and certainly within inner city areas it's a real challenge. So I'm really looking forward to the presentation myself. Before we get going, and just before I hand over to Simon, I'd like to sort of thank Ian Russell at the London Borough of Enfield for us to use this case study during the presentation today. And just to warm ourselves up, I'd like to just run a very quick poll and launch a poll on this question. Have you assessed the benefits of retrofitting SuDS? So it's a straight, almost a straightforward yes or no. If you have you used the Syria's BEST tool that kind of helps us to provide some benefit to those approaches? And if you have but used another approach, that's fine too. So we've got a really good turnout today, by the way, folks. Virtually 500 people that are in, and still growing as I'm talking. We now have over 500 attending the webinar, so this will be a great straw poll to run. We've had a good number of you have voted already, so if you'd just like to take a look at the poll and vote now, we'll close it in a couple of seconds and share the results. 3, 2, 1. And just share those results before handing over to Simon. So 75% have not been able to be in a position to assess the benefits of retrofitting SuDS right now. So great way to hand over to yourself, Simon, to show us how it's done. For those that have done it, just over a half of those have done it, but without the use of the Syria BEST tool. So 11% of the audience have used the Syria BEST tool. We'll get into that in a future webinar maybe for you. So I'll hide that feedback, and without further ado, hand over to yourself, Simon Ainley. Take it away, Simon.
Thank you for that, Peter, and thank you, Ben, for the introduction. It's an honour to be able to present to so many people, and a little bit nerve-wracking, to be honest, but hopefully I'll do all right. So for this project, I'll just give a very brief overview. This project's been delivered through a number of key stakeholders, as already alluded to. Ian Russell at Enfield Council was quite instrumental, but the overall goal for the project was looking at trying to derive the financial benefits embodied by long-term commitment to retrofitting SuDS. So not just individual features, but actually a longer-term commitment to continue the investment in SuDS. And ultimately, this project was aiming to produce evidence that hopefully will catalyse that as a sort of future direction, and we can improve the resilience of our catchments by investing in this approach. The specific aims, as I allude to, is to demonstrate the benefit that SuDS can provide. There's lots of information, general information on how SuDS are useful and beneficial, but there's not quite as much that demonstrates their specific benefit around flood mitigation to enable robust, investable, sustainable investment streams that can keep the investment in this kind of approach going. The project had a few key objectives. Just very quickly, we wanted to look at developing technical workflows to see how best, see the methods best to actually evaluate the benefits, be that modelling, costs, natural capital, and a few other elements of the project there. We obviously spent a lot of time looking at natural capital, which is sort of the setup for the question, the poll that was just given. We obviously looked at the government funding, which ultimately is the thing we've been trying to alleviate at the end of the project. And that in itself helps potentially to enable this investment in future, make it more resilient and make it easier for authority to get that investment for this long-term investment. Just to give you some geography, so the project had sort of two stages, although I'm kind of presenting everything just as one sort of outcome really. But we had sort of 4 outer London catchments initially. Enfield, we had 2, one in Hillingdon and one in Kingston upon Thames, which are the ones sort of around the edges. And then the phase 2 was where we really galvanised the efforts in the first phase, first stage, where we learned from the things that didn't quite go well, and we tried to grow and develop the methodology on the inner London catchments, which are Westminster, Camden and Southwark on either side of the Thames, so the 2 big orange blobs in the middle. A lot of the outcomes will be related to those largely in this presentation. And just to give it a bit of a sort of a preface to the challenge, which I think is already been, Peter already alluded to this, but there was quite a recognition about a lot of the surface water management plan programme of works and the Drain London modelling that was undertaken, that there are opportunities for major surface water flood relief schemes and major improvements, but actually in a lot of places the only real practical option available or left is retrofitting much smaller scale features at sort of a neighbourhood community level. And this is driven by constraints, especially in very densely urbanised environments. The government funding mechanisms, as I already alluded to, it can be very difficult to prove the benefit, the specific calculated cost benefits to the Environment Agency for a small street of SuDS features, for example, even if as part of a much wider investment in SuDS, they would provide quite a significant improvement. And there's obviously, this is a common theme across SuDS, generating sustainable infrastructure, but there still remains some uncertainty around CAPEX and the benefits they provide, and although they can be seen as more of a risky investment compared to more traditional approaches. So what we looked at for the scheme is to try and address some of these challenges, these constraints, these issues. One element of this is trying to demonstrate this return on investment, so to prove that this is an investable strategy at any scale, whether you're delivering a few features in one street or whether you wish to deliver hundreds if not thousands over the course of 25 to 50 years. Accounting for their whole value. Now this is not necessarily a modelling element, this is a much wider piece. Natural capital is an enormous discipline in itself, but we've made sure we've kind of integrated that, and that becomes part of the calculation. Looking at methods we can use, some of those methods are the modelling methods that we can use to calculate this cost benefit and this return on investment, and then share it across other catchments. And ultimately creating a bit of a situation where we can engage a much wider community of stakeholders and investors. And for that, generating information and data to prove it's a worthwhile investment, I think is critical if we're going to move into this new phase of investment in this kind of infrastructure over longer periods of time. Just the technical aspects of the project are sort of broken down into these key elements that we looked at, right? Natural capital, costing, the actual design of SuDS, all the way through to, you know, evaluating the economics of the outcome to prove their investments. But for this presentation, I'm largely going to focus on the hydraulic modelling and the sort of outcome, the flood damage mitigation outcomes that we have derived, mainly because I think that's of most interest, I suspect, to the audience in this case. So for this, before we got into the modelling, we made sure we tried to understand the sort of requirements we may need from the modelling to enable this whole process to work. The first being looking at having coverage to enable this large-scale assessment. So instead of starting small and working big, we wanted to start big and work inwards to work out where best to invest. And linked to that is the ability to run numerous scenarios or versions to try and identify optimal strategies. Optimization is going to be a big topic. It was a big topic in this and a big challenge, and I'll talk about that later in a bit more detail. But to look at optimal strategies to calculate flood damage benefits, we needed to run numerous simulations and numerous different return period events. So we had to develop something suitable for that. And the representation of SuDS, obviously. So how we represent realistic, accurate SuDS that do the job in giving us that flood damage calculation at the end of the day. So the preferred approach initially, which would seem fairly sensible and logical, was to develop or utilize and upgrade fully integrated 1D, 2D models of catchments. So we understand the full interconnectivity of the surface water systems, the buried systems, the combined system, the foul system, where they interact, things like combined overflows, and really understand how implementing SuDS would benefit the full water system within these catchments in London. For the first stages, this is largely what we did. We had lots of models that we picked up from the original Drain London work that we could use with only minor adjustments to make them fit our needs. The actual modelling of SuDS and the locations we chose initially was based on using gullies, which were modelled, so explicitly modelled gullies in the existing model. We used them as our effectively surrogate sites, surrogate opportunities, and through a very fairly simplistic approach, effectively just changing the gully pot. So just looking at a diagram on the left, changing the gully pot to actually include an effective volume of storage, which represented whatever that SuDS feature needed to be before water would then eventually spill into the drainage system or completely fill up to the surface and then flood back out on the surface and continue on where it wanted to go through overland mechanisms. This approach was we elected to go this approach because of simplicity in that initial process, and we had yet to really define a method to identify opportunities that didn't require just using the models in themselves. That becomes a bit obvious in a minute when I talk about the inner London catchments. And that, sorry, I should have put that up. That's an example of one area, one of the catchments, just showing the network and showing the gullies. The sizes just indicate the volume of storage you put into different chambers. So there are different SuDS types, different opportunities, and different areas of volume you can see in there. As I allude to, this wasn't this approach didn't really fully work for all of our catchments and was later abandoned as a standalone concept for the inner London catchments, so the Westminster, Camden and Southwark, if you remember, catchments in the centre. The main reason why not was because of what I'm calling unworkable simulation times. So obviously with integrated 1D 2D modelling there can be time penalties and effort penalties in developing these. So to understand the systems properly, to really integrate our SuDS into these models, they had to include the highway drainage infrastructure and a number of additional surface water networks, as well as the combined systems of which dominate centre of London and are quite critical to the drainage of that part of the catchment. So that complexity notched up things like simulation times. The resolution of the 2D model, if you want to look at these features, we found that it's quite important that it goes down to what we call a streetscape level. So you need to see your pavements, you need to see the smaller features because they make a reasonable amount of difference to the amount of water that can get in and out of localized small micro SuDS features. Even depths down to 100 mil make a big difference. If your 2D model is too coarse, you just don't see these features and you run the risk of significantly under or over predicting. And the scale of the model. So scale is a big point in this this assessment. Like I said, the 3 London boroughs is a significant area, and we not only included those boroughs and those boundaries, but also the entire sewerage networks of the Beckton and Crossness treatment works, which cover a significant chunk of London if you know that part of the city. The reason why is to understand and connect to all the features that SuDS may benefit. So if you want to see the benefit on the combined system, you need to include the local system, but also the system all the way down to the works to see the effect potentially on CSOs and pump stations and other interconnected infrastructure. So like I said, scale is an important factor in this, and this is one of the biggest challenges we faced initially for these catchments. And as I mentioned before, scale is also important because if you want to optimize or find the more optimal places to invest, it's a more rational approach to start big and work your way in. So starting large is what we needed to do. So an empirical top-down assessment is the strategy we approach for these ones. So for these inner London ones, we ended up with a split approach. We'll use 1D and 2D models. I'm not going to really talk about the 1D model approach because it was a bit simpler in a way. I'm going to focus on just quickly on the 2D models we used. We did a fairly standard development approach. We calibrated the runoff using the 1D models, so we made sure that the discharge rates in roads would represent what would likely to happen with the number of gullies that exist in that road, with the general capacity gullies provide, and the water level in the sewers in the 1D model within those roads. Ergo, where there are areas where sewers are generally surcharged during events, the gully discharge rates would be substantially lower to sort of mimic that effect. That's just indicating the sort of thing I'm talking about. One benefit, now I'll just talk about the pros and cons of the 2D only approach we employed, is simplicity and efficiency. So by obviously disconnecting the 1D, simulations become far quicker and easier to formulate and run and extract results from. So we could assess a larger range of scenarios and a larger range of conditions to give us more data to make more robust conclusions from. But the negatives, the obvious negative is we're not able now to directly calculate the sewerage or capacity and headroom benefits that SuDS like this could provide. We did undertake a process for this where we effectively used the predictions from the 2D model to calibrate the 1D model, effectively reduce the contributions to the sewers accordingly. The outcomes from that I will talk about later, although I don't think I've got time now in this talk to go through actually how we did it in any detail. So that's kind of the key areas around building the models we use to assess the scenarios and to assess the benefits. It's obviously a very, very simplified approach, and if you want to know any more of the details, obviously that's probably a good question to add into the question lists for later. But I thought I'd move on to the actual SuDS features themselves, the representation of them, and how we approached these. So alongside the initial strategy of looking at fully integrated 1D, 2D models and the outer London boroughs where we did use 1D, 2D models, we did think that we would see if we could represent the features in 2D. Now the reason why we elected to start this was initially because we came up with a method to try and identify the opportunities in the catchment, which is what you're looking at the bottom. So these areas we defined as potential opportunities based on the available land, so the land take that the SuDS would potentially could occupy. So by creating that data, we did this over significant areas, which accounts for local guidance and design guidance on pavements and roads, etc., to be sort of robust and effectively feasible, at least in where you could deliver these features. We thought initially it'd be fairly simple to bring them in the model as mesh zones and use those mesh zones, effectively depress the area, create some volume storage on the surface so that it would take away from the roads, and that would create your benefit. So that's what we approached approached it as. Because we think it shows a nice accurate representation of footprints, and we thought that'd be the easiest way of doing it. However, unfortunately we found that this came with some negatives. The first major issue we found in doing this process, although we did overcome it at some cost in terms of time, was around the meshing of 2D models with that kind of data in there. So effectively it required quite extensive but precise GIS work to derive these polygons, to fit them into the mesh zones and stuff we use to actually create the 2D zones. So we use mesh zones to create the roads and the pavements and the buildings and things like that. So we have that accuracy at the streetscape level I mentioned, but then including these features as well, ensuring that things like vertices were perfectly aligned and corrected and overlaps. We would get it 98% of the way there, but even the last 2% was a lot of corrections. So there's lots of work back and forth between the GIS platforms and InfoWorks to get those corrected. Again, there's a scale issue to the scale and complexity of what we were doing. So a lot of geoprocessing automation had to be done, and obviously maintaining accuracy of that was occasionally a challenge. Some of the things we learned, which I think is probably a common thing in lots of 2D modeling, this is nothing unique, but effectively is simplifying the master map data in the first place can quite substantially help this process out by removing that kind of unnecessary vertices and topological complexity. And one thing I'll just note here that we didn't have access to at the time because we did it in a previous version, but in the more recent versions, I think it's actually ICM 11, not ICM 2021, was that there's a new meshing algorithm that I've not actually had a chance to really use in Anger yet. Maybe other people have, but potentially has opportunity to improve some of this, to resolve or at least address some of these issues around complex geometry that at the time we didn't necessarily have chance to test out. Also, we found another sort of emergent issue of the way we've modeled it was that a lot of the SuDS features, being linear features along the side of a road, acted more like conveyance features than they did as storage features. And in many places we would notice that floodwater would build up in the road, would pour into our SuDS feature, would travel down the SuDS feature, and at the end of it, they would pour back out onto the pavement, not onto the road. Or they would just pour onto the pavement, but not necessarily back onto the road, sorry, but not necessarily store much volume of water. And it's pretty obvious in hindsight that this is related to the fact that you don't really include the detail that are say a bioretention basin in a pavement would actually require in real life, such as specifically raised curbs, the inlet curbs, any check dams along the way, and a proper consideration for the profile of the pavement and the buildings next to it to ensure that water fills up correctly, and when it reaches capacity, it will just overflow back into the road, or obviously into a drain and straight down to the sewer. So that level of connectivity. At the scale we've looked at this, whereby we've been modelled thousands and thousands of features over numerous different scenarios, is not appropriate to model that kind of detail for every single feature, given each feature is bespoke to its location in a road or part of the catchment. So this kind of outcome, I suppose, wasn't entirely unexpected, but it was interesting to see it sort of in action. And then related to the second point, so we found that in many places properties were flooding with our SuDS in where before they weren't, partly related to the fact that those properties are below the level of the pavements in real life. And if you don't have the resolution of that kind of level, you're not going to be able to ensure the water gets back in the road. It's going to flow in a different path, an unrealistic path. And our SuDS features were actually creating more paths for it to go into these places than less paths. We were creating a problem by including that. And a very specific London-based issue, although it's not specifically London, but I know that it can be a wide-ranging issue in London, is basements, which show up as depressions in the LiDAR. So again, if we're putting features in that pull water into the pavement, and then next to that pavement is a building that actually shows it to be, 1.5 meters below the ground, when in real life there's actually a little step to it, and then stairs up into the first floor, but then before there's a basement, we again create artificially increased flood damages that wouldn't actually exist if you design that feature properly. So we found that the modelling in 2D is very challenging and is very scale dependent. So there is definitely a need to match the modelling approach with what we call the scale of the intervention. So if we're looking at micro features, micro scale SuDS, which is what we're kind of referring to for these, you know, they're very sensitive to small changes in depth and elevation. So it has to be a consideration for that. So for this one, the key thing we need to understand to derive benefit is really just the volume that these features attenuate, not specifically how deep the water gets in there and how the water travels around inside them. So we elected to move to a slightly more simplistic 1D method to try and get around this challenge. It's not complicated, as you'd expect, and that's a positive thing. We just use 1D nodes, and you just put them in the road. You give them a chamber area. That chamber area is effectively your effective SuDS storage volume, which was made up of, you imagine the water level above, say the soil that the medium's built in, and also includes an element of the subsoil capacity. They have been derived from the 2D features. So as I mentioned before, the schedule of features we derived in terms of their land take and where they actually sit. We use that to understand where to put our nodes and what volume those nodes should have. And one key element that you have to do is to shift a lot of the pavement features into the carriageway. So as you imagine, many of these features are built into the pavement as opposed to built out to the road, or they're in kind of pedestrianised areas. If you leave them there, it relies on water being on that pavement area. In real life, a lot of these pavement features will be designed to directly allow carriageway runoff to flow into them via little drop curbs, for example. In the 2D models, our pavements are slightly elevated compared to our roads, which is kind of a standard practice to ensure you get the definition of the curbs, which are very important for routing. So we couldn't leave them on the pavement because they just wouldn't store enough, they wouldn't collect the water. So they've been artificially shifted into the centre of the carriageway. So they look something like that. So as you can see, the black areas are the derived footprints for the opportunities, and the blue dots are all the resultant nodes we created to actually operate the model. And again, the benefit that this gave us around enabling us to focus on the attenuation capacity they provided, which ultimately is the main lever for the flood damage protection they provide, removes the need to understand the physical structure and how it actually functions. Much more simple. It runs much simpler. Very easy creation of scenarios. So the need to continuously remesh. As you imagine, the area of Westminster, Camden and Southwark, meshing took quite a while sometimes. So for the numerous scenarios we run, which is numbering in the late 30s, early 40s, I can't remember, different scenarios we looked at in the end, obviously would have come at an enormous penalty in terms of time, and that saved a lot of that effort. That kind of wraps up what I wanted to talk about when it comes to the sort of specific modelling bits, and I'm very interested to get some questions on anything more specific about this, because I appreciate I've kind of just bounced over it very, very simplistically. But yeah, so feel free to fire some questions about anything specific on.
I was going to say that, Simon. Sorry to cut you off there, but should I ask a few questions? There are some questions that are coming in. There's some sort of holistic ones, but there's also some detailed ones. Just like 3 or 4 that I could sort of raise with you. I'm not going to run over time. The first one is, it was the 2D only model aspect. Is there possibility to represent an inlet within a 2D model? Was there a possibility to actually represent an inlet, but within the 2D model is the question that's come in.
Well, you can represent inlets as the sort of flood type for nodes, if that's what you want. But I think we did think about the slightly more detailed way of modeling them. But again, for each of these features, and if you look at this as an example here, there's a feature down here which runs the whole length of the pavement. In real life, you're not building a SuDS feature as the whole length of that pavement. It would probably be multiple smaller features with gaps for access, for car, driveways, all this kind of thing. Though that's just showing the opportunity, not necessarily actually what you're going to build. So we didn't want to put too much effort on representing specific, inlet structures and arrangements, because we don't know where that's actually going to be. And most of them in real life will be very dependent on utilities, street furniture and stuff like that. That makes the actual location very hard to work out at this point. So we just elected to use nodes which allow water to freely flow into them. So basically it just assumes that it will be designed in a way that makes it quite efficient for water on the carriageway to flow into the features, fill them up, and then drain out somewhere else. So yes, you can model things like inlets and do that detail, but that comes down to the ability to do that kind of thing at scale and whether you have enough information to make it accurate or not.
Great. There are two nice little leading questions that are fairly quick for you to answer, I think. But one is, when you were looking at the sites for retrofitting, were the buried services taken into account? And I can imagine, you can imagine the,
Nope.
the amount of services. Yeah, you can imagine the issue of digging it.
Yeah, obviously that's one of the biggest challenging questions of this sort of thing, is because there are utilities everywhere. And I personally think we're not that great in this country at collating and managing and sharing information about that. It can be hard to collect the information, and plenty of projects we worked on, we just get a PDF with some very general lines drawn on it for whatever those utilities are. As you can imagine, we're not going to ask for that for the whole of 3 whole inner London districts and then digitize it all and then work out what it is. That would have taken months probably. And that's not what we're trying to do. And maybe my previous point as well, by the fact I said, we're looking at this entire segment and we made an assumption about how much of that we're likely to achieve and use that to adjust the volume that it provides. So we've not modeled it as if that entire thing is a bioretention feature. We've modeled it as if maybe 20% of that is a bioretention feature. The rest of it is lost to accesses and utilities and things like that.
Yeah, great. And when the quick one, just to ask the question on this, there was I'm just trying to find it again there. It was basically the size, the number of nodes and things. What kind of size are the models that we're looking at? How many nodes, for example?
Oh, good question. I can't give you an answer on that one. The only way I can give you a different answer, the Beckton and Crossness models, I think when you add them together, come to 5 million population.
Yeah, exactly. When you mention Beckton and Crossness, for folks that aren't aware, I mean, these are the 2 biggest treatment plants for the east and west of London, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the north of the Thames and south of the Thames, basically. And
exactly.
So I can't give you that. I don't know what that number is. Large is the answer. So, but yeah, it serves a population of around about 5 plus or minus a bit. I can't remember the exact figure, and that's roughly half-ish of London's overall general population. So it's a significant chunk of London.
Yeah,
and admittedly, I think we elected to look at those because we wanted to be quite aspirational. We wanted to push the boundary a little bit. I think probably in hindsight, it might have been slightly easier with slightly smaller areas, but we still think it's valuable to have looked at a big area, look out, and then we can work inwards. So we've kind of almost pushed the boundaries of what we could do with the model and the assessment. And I have to admit, a lot of the project involved drowning in obscene amounts of exported data and trying to bring it all together sometimes. So, but yeah, big models, to put it that way.
Great. Thanks, Simon. And just one comment for everyone. There's a few folks asking if there will be a record. There is going to be a recording of this, by the way, folks, and they're asking for a copy of the PDF of the presentation. Yeah. So that's something we can deal with. Lovely. Thanks, Simon. I'll let you carry on.
No, thank you. Okay, so yes, thank you all. Yes, keep them coming. So the next, I thought I'd show you some actually outcomes of the modelling. I've just told you some of the model build stuff now, and then how we turn that into the economic evaluation. So drift slightly outside of the core modelling aspects and more into kind of the outcome and where we'd like to see things progress in the future. But just to give an indication of some of the predictions, that's just a chunk of Southwark, somewhere in the middle of Southwark. I can't remember road names, but it's probably useful to keep it a bit anonymous. So this is a sort of a centre of Southwark, and just for example, I think this is a 1 in 10 year event, sort of showing the calculated or predicted benefits for this SuDS scenario. This SuDS scenario is quite an extensive one, so this is probably assuming a good 50-year investment in SuDS and quite a reasonable amount of money invested to get things improved, but it does show these substantial improvements you can get to not only property flooding, but just general highway nuisance flooding, you call it that. And what we did for the project, because of the scale of it for these inner London catchments, so that again is Westminster, Camden and Southwark, surrounding the City of London, we agglomerated the outcomes, the predictions and benefits and damages into a hex grid. This is actually the TfL, Transport for London. This is what they use for sort of grouping things together. But we kind of grouped it into this because it's easier to understand than if we just showed that previous map, but we zoomed out to the whole of this catchment. You wouldn't be able to tell anything. And this is how we did a lot of the assessment, by doing it at this sort of scale. This is just an indication of the sort of damage avoidance that could be generated by this approach. That the percentage is just percentage of flood damages avoided on a 30-year event. So even if you're looking at sort of the dark greys, that's sort of 40% or higher of all flood damages over the course of 50-year period, and for a 1 in 30 year. So you can see it's quite clustered, which is what we found interesting. So it's not just generalized benefits, even though this is looking at SuDS delivered everywhere. It actually shows very, very clusterized benefits and areas that you don't really get much benefit for one reason or another. That's just showing a couple of those areas that you can get quite substantial benefits. So, like I said, ultimately this project aimed to provide some key information, largely financial justification for investment in SuDS. And it's more about that than it is about coming up with a very specific list of features that should be built for these catchments. This was a pilot project, and we're really looking to understand how we can turn this modelling and this approach into giving some tangible evidence that this is the right way to go forward, and to help bring people like the Environment Agency along with us when it comes to submitting business cases and justifying investments. So these are just some extracts from the report we produced for the project. So I don't know about all the details, but this is just to give you an indication for those inner London catchments of the sort of scale we've looked at and where the modelling plays in. So the flood damage avoidance is the orange bars. So maybe just consider this first scenario up the top here. This is just looking at all opportunities. So for these areas, we looked at potentially £900 million worth of flood damage protection over the course of a 50-year period, admittedly with an investment at this point of just over 2 billion in capital investment. But this does actually generate not only flood damage protection, but our natural capital, which is our hashed block at the bottom, which at this point is significantly outweighs flood benefit, which is an interesting, if not wholly unsurprising outcome of the project. And then looking at an alternative way, looking at cost-benefit ratios, and this is again of delivering it anywhere. So you'll see we've got ratios relatively low. So looking at flood damages, we don't break one if you just delivered SuDS everywhere. However, obviously, you bring in natural capital, it can grow to positive numbers. Some of the alternative strategies, especially around street trees and living roofs, have much higher cost-benefit ratios. However, there's less opportunity for these ones, so the overall magnitude would be less, hence they're smaller over here. But that was the base case, so to speak. So that's the fully built out ultimate, maybe almost vision or aspiration, which I fully admit it's never going to happen. No one, no matter how long you spend, we're never going to spend £2.1 billion on sustainable infrastructure in just 3 boroughs. We probably won't spend that on all sustainable infrastructure in a few decades, probably. But this is giving a bit of a target outcome, and what we've used this for is to work backwards to work out where do we actually invest within this to deliver most of this outcome. So a big part of the assessment for this, and it's what we did a lot of model runs for. So that's why I said we needed models we could run numerous scenarios and test for. It's not just developing a model with SuDS in it, but it's developing numerous versions of that model where we test up and we try and find where the optimal places for these SuDS actually are. So this is just an indication of showing that investment I talked about, that 2.1 billion, which is on the bottom, but also charting the cost benefit. So what we did is we went through a process of looking at optimizing, or at least finding the most optimal places to invest, which generally was worked out by looking at delivering the most flood benefit within your local area at the least capital investment. There's probably many ways you can look at this, but that's the general way we ended looking at it. It's a bit more complicated than that, the process, but that's generally what it was. And then ultimately ranking effectively all those opportunities in different places and then being able to plot them on a graph. So what you're seeing here is ranked investment from the most optimum on the left to the least optimum. I know I've stopped it at 500. So go across your screen 3 more times. That's everything. And if you just focus again on the orange line, which is sort of looking at all opportunities, again, you can see that at the far right-hand side, you'd be down close to a half or something. Obviously, I haven't seen that, but eventually when you get over here, you see this quite sharp increase. The dotted line increases indicates that uncertainty goes up a little bit at this point, so that's why I want to do it as a dotted line. But you can see how, especially with some of the other ones, looking at the buyer retention, which is this one, you get a very small chunk over here that goes from 3 to 4 points return on investment up into the 20s and maybe potentially into 30s and 40s, depending on which ones you find. So this was a key outcome that we found, and key conclusion, that the modelling and the assessment enabled us to actually figure out that if you just look at SuDS generally across wide areas, you'll get some benefit, but it'll probably be outweighed in many places by the natural capital, and you will probably struggle to get your FDGI funding or equivalent government funding purely on the fact that it gives a fairly low return on investment, say compared to building a new drainage system, which you could prove a really good benefit by investing in that kind of infrastructure. But if you could find these optimal places over here, and this is maybe the optimal 50 million in here, which potentially over 50 years could be something that could be achieved, you could deliver most of the benefit in that catchment. Looking at a different way, this is just another way we looked at the data. So this is damage reduction per SuDS feature. So we just averaged out the damage reduction per feature for a number of scenarios. And again, the black is the non-optimal. So if you just deliver them anyway, that's what you get. And again, if you look at the streetscape one, because it's quite marked, once you look at the top 5% of all the opportunities, that's top 5% of the capital investment, it's substantially more than your non-optimal approach. So optimization is key and gives a very, very tangible output. And this is just a sort of very similar data, just graphed. So again, this is now showing those hex grids, but pointing out where we managed to find the most optimal places. And that's again, the most optimal % of the overall investment is in very defined areas and not in others, which is quite, and this is what we wanted to come out with, to show that the strategizing for SuDS, it is very important to look at things like these models to help this process and help justify investments in these areas, but also conversely to look at the areas where we're going to struggle to justify it, and that's where multi-partnership approaches need to be considered, and the wider natural capital benefits start to come into play, and other investors and other parts of the other disciplines and industries may take a bigger role in trying to help us deliver sustainable infrastructure. And one last thing that I haven't really talked about, but I alluded to earlier, was the wastewater network. So this project was focused on optimizing or finding the most optimal features for, more in relation to flood damages and flood damages, protection from flood damages, because that helps generate funding through the EA and other mechanisms. But one element of this is for the water utilities in terms of their systems, so capacity and headroom in their systems, and that can extend to sort of foul flooding and things like CSO discharges and the operation of pumps and carbon, etc. So we did an assessment of the potential benefit of this also to their systems, a cursory assessment, to look at different options and how potentially that could create headroom for, in this case, dwellings. It's what Thames Water they agreed that dwellings is the best metric to understand what we could provide. And that's just indicating for some of these features what could be created. So dwellings on the left and a percentage of total population increase on the right. So again, it was quite substantial that we can get a reasonable amount of extra dwellings provided for by this approach to SuDS. I will say that this doesn't include this isn't really optimization. So if we haven't optimized it for how the sewer system works, it's optimized for what happens on the surface. So there's a whole new piece of work on that probably needs to be considered. And that on the right is an example, sorry, I forgot to put it up, of the same data, but we could actually work it out on a sewer by sewer basis. So you can actually start to see which sewers get the most, generated the most benefit from the SuDS we considered. That's the Fleet Storm sewer, if people are aware of it, that goes around Regent's Park and into the Thames in the bottom right. So we thought that Thames thought that was quite a valuable outcome to be able to actually visualize where SuDS delivered on the surface could generate benefit for in the network. And this is the other reason why having a much bigger model was important, because some of these benefits extend all the way down to the sewage treatment works, and they're not just localized, they actually have a distance to them. So that's why that scale we found was quite important to consider. So I'll just finish up then. I've tried to collect a few lessons learned and recommendations. There are more than this, and some of these are a little bit subjective because, again, it's a pilot study, so we can draw other conclusions from them. But these are the sort of key things I wanted to just sort of almost reiterate. I think I've kind of talked about these already, but scale. So there's that consideration of the scale. So what are we modeling? It needs to be related to that scale. And when we think about SuDS, specifically these micro SuDS, it's that streetscape pavement scale that needs to be considered, which can come at a cost in terms of the modeling. 1D versus 2D. So as you hopefully kind of can see, we much prefer the 1D approach to doing the assessment at this level. It creates a far more realistic evaluation of volume, and just makes it fundamentally easier to make the process work. The location, so one of the key outcomes, again, as I showed you with that previous diagram, the previous map, sorry, that location is a very important factor in where SuDS deliver the most benefit, and why it's important to run numerous model runs to kind of really work out where that location plays into the overall benefits. And it's even more important, we found, that actually which type of SuDS you include. So we looked at different types of SuDS and different approaches to them, and actually it was the location had a far more bigger bearing on the benefits than actually how you design and implement the SuDS themselves. So it's almost a lesson that whatever SuDS you want to do is fine. Maybe finding the best location for them is worth that extra effort than it is, defining the actual design and approach to delivering them. Variability. So we did look at whether there's any commonality in catchments. So whether we can find common outcomes, common benefits, common cost-benefit ratios, for example, that we could then look at different catchments that haven't been modeled and basically apply them to it, use them as surrogate catchments. But we found there's so much variability in the urbanization, the topography, the elevation factors, the networks, especially where there's watercourse, the intercept systems, they can dramatically change where your benefits get realized. So yeah, all the catchments acted relatively uniquely in terms of the magnitude of benefit that things provide, which just gives a bit of weight to the need to model. I already alluded to the water utility. So again, we haven't really looked into optimal places to invest based on the network, which will be different than optimal places for surface water benefits. The surface water benefits tend to be far more in situ, they don't go too far, whereas the networks can obviously be many kilometers away and obviously connected by a wholly different network under the ground. Quality versus quantity. So we found that by having slightly more simplistic approach to the modeling enable us to run larger volumes of predictions that I feel gave us a slightly more robust outcome, more robust predictions, more statistically robust metrics to justify investment, because that's what we're looking at. It's not to say that that's the way it should always be, and there'll be other occasions when it might be wise to be the other way around. If you've got a bit more of an understanding of sort of where you want to invest, the quality may go over the quantity. And at that point, you might want to consider more precise methods to represent them, so long as you're willing to accept the penalty in terms of simulation time and complexity of development. Optimization. So obviously I talked about optimization. There is a major, I won't call it major, there is a issue that remains in this, which we've thought about, but we've not really gone too far to try and resolve within this project. And it's something around what I'm calling causality. So in a lot of traditional modeling schemes to address flooding, so for example, a basin in a park or a storage tank or a new sewerage system, the solution, so to speak, is a single solution. It's a single feature, operates in a very singular way, and it will generally address a cluster of properties, normally downstream, and it'll address that. So it's kind of what I call a one-to-one relationship. So you've got one problem to solve largely, and you've got one solution you look at to solve that problem. And you can test a few versions and calculate the benefits, and that's fairly easy. What I found with this, especially when you're trying to find the most optimal places, is that micro SuDS delivered like this across catchments when you can is more of what I might call a many-to-many relationship. So you'll have lots of streets of lots of features which may help improve or reduce flood damages for lots of different properties downstream, and they might not be the same cluster. They might be in a number of different clusters, connected apart. So it's trying to find which of those features, where do you start investing first? Where do you start building first? Because it's very hard to work that relationship out, because you can't work in causality out between one feature and the benefits downstream. It can be difficult. So it's sort of a legacy uncertainty in the process that we're looking to address in some future projects coming up. But I'm open to hear ideas and to see if anyone else can come up with slightly more rational ways to try and work out that causality and be quite specific to work out which features are the ones you want to deliver first to get your best return on investment across large catchments and large areas. I mean, there's a few points below is the ones we've almost recommended, but we haven't really looked into yet. Is things like multi-objective optimization, but that would require probably much more simplistic models, probably largely just simplistic 1D models, more black box modeling in a way to enable a multiple simulations to be run to really work out which ones are the best ones. Potentially, this is probably more viable of the lot, is spending a bit more time up front, so a bit of a desktop, we call pre-scoping stage in GIS, to really tease apart your catchment and work out how things are generally related, so you can create groups, so almost try and work out the one-to-one relationships at a kind of conceptual level first, and then you can compare all those different groups to one another and work out which groups are the most optimal and which groups are not the most optimal. So you wouldn't work out individual features, but groups of features might, or streets, for example, or neighborhoods together. And then just thinking out of the box a little bit, there's always room, I think, to stretch the boundaries a little bit, but neural networks and machine learning and really black box approaches might, you never know, they might be the sort of thing that could give some interesting outcomes and save on a lot of the complex model development time. This is not necessarily an outcome of the project, but just almost a demonstration of modeling of a benefit of ICM is the risk master module that we used extensively for this project. Initially, I was quite worried that by running lots and lots and lots of simulations and calculating the flood damages avoided for all those different simulations would entail a lot of external spreadsheet work and all the pain that would go with that. But by using the risk master, it enabled us to very rapidly calculate all the economics we needed and take them out, put them in our own spreadsheets, and work through creating the graphs and the outcomes I showed you earlier. So I'm just basically hats off to how that tool works. It's a very, very valuable tool, and it's fairly easy to use once you get into it. So I recommend everyone consider investing in that if you haven't, if you're around projects like this. And one last point was around the different features still provide quite a bit of a different benefits overall to the return on investment, which is obvious. It's not something that we really talked about too much because in real life you're not going to just deliver one type of feature. You'll probably deliver what opportunities are available to you, but it was an interesting outcome nonetheless. So given we have 7 minutes left, I went on a few minutes longer than I want, that draws it to a close. So thank you very much for listening to me drone on. I hope my voice wasn't too boring. If you've got any more questions, I guess now's the time.
Brilliant. That was excellent, Simon. I really, really appreciated not just the whole experience, but the thought processes that went behind what you were trying to do and the roadblocks that you came across, etc. To have those multiple benefits come in. Some of the key takeaways that I got was the multiple benefits that are coming through. If you try to sort of base this just on flood alleviation, you're going to struggle with the FDGIA funding, but when you get natural capital involved and when you start putting in bioretention areas within highways, you're going to improve the safety aspects by slowing down flows, you're going to get a better outcome. And taking the water out of the system, I love that graphic where you did the graphic for Thames Water showing how you can sort of take water out of the system effectively, and the link with the surface water management and exceedance flows as well when we're dealing with SuDS. So many good things that come out of it. There are some more questions. There's no way we're going to get through them all. The floodgates opened from about 1:30 onwards, so you've really triggered the audience off in a good way. But I'll draw some up because you've kind of answered them, but it may be worth just emphasising some of the points.
Yeah, sure.
One of them was from Paul. So was it ever considered during the project, rather than modelling all the interventions, to build some test sites and monitor the performance of the test site? Would that be a more effective way of maybe spending some money and then applying the learning from those in terms of reduction in discharge from the catchment to the model?
Yeah, I agree. I think that is an essential part of the SuDS discipline that I still think needs a lot of work on, is that ground truthing how things function. So no, I agree. I think that what we had here, the remit didn't extend to that. We were almost one conceptual stage higher than that in a way, the way we want to look at it. But I agree, that's probably a key element, and it's something that's maybe for future projects needs to be considered, and it can be brought in to almost calibrate or benchmark or validate the modelling approach we took. But yeah, for this project we didn't have the remit, so to speak, to look at actual site-based.
Sure. That's fine. Another one from Akshay. Were you able to compare the results for any part of the model between like 2D and 1D approaches that you mentioned?
Well, not explicitly, because like I said, when we found the issues of how the 2D representation caused a lot of them to act as conveyance channels as opposed to actually storage features and sort of flood out the properties, at that point we were kind of slightly alarmed at how it was working. So it was overtly obvious that we were causing problems, because, well, initially on the surface you couldn't necessarily see a lot of it because, you know, we were zoomed out. It's a big area. We went through the economics very quickly to see what that would look like. And we found for some of the scenarios the flood damages were actually higher afterwards than it was before. So obviously the alarm bells were struck immediately when that happened, and that's when obviously we did a bit of a deep dive and went in to find them. It wasn't most of them actually. A lot of them still worked fine. Obviously, it's the ones that tend to be more in steeper roads, you know, slightly steeper terrain that would, you know, root flow down. It's those ones, and there were just a few of them that were very, very in that place where they're taking a lot of flow, and it was pouring it into the wrong places. There were places where there were basements again, so the volume, the depth increase was substantial. So obviously, the calculated flood damage went through the roof, so to speak. Excuse the pun. So I think that's what we found there. We don't have a direct comparison. I was actually looking to get some of the predictions for people to actually show you that factor coming into play. But I really realized yesterday I've subsequently deleted all the simulations to save space on our server because they're quite huge and I didn't have time to rerun them. So I apologize for not being able to show you that effect in anger.
No problem. Were there any controls considered within the modelling to cause features to actually fill up and potentially draw down? Did you get to that level of detail?
No, again, that's a sort of thing we thought that, yeah, there is the drain down thing, but we were really focused on singular design event type approaches. We didn't want to drift into too much complexity when it comes to the rainfall and how they function and operate. So as I said, we ended up with just trying to have, it's that volume. We wanted to work out what's that volume they take out of the system at that first flush of rainfall. And after they're filled up, the system just continues on as it does always. So I suppose there is an admission in there that we're looking at a case, unique cases of more sort of significant rainfalls, 1 in 10 events, and how that affects that for flood damages. But then in more frequent common rainfall, obviously one of the challenges with SuDS is things getting saturated, getting filled up, back-to-back rainfall impacts when things can't drain down effectively enough. So all that aspect there, I recognise is not really a core aspect of what we managed to achieve for this one, because, like I said, it's more about the business case. It's more about justifying funding than it is about actually demonstrating how it would actually function, if that makes sense. So yeah. we've tried to stay away from that, because you open up such a big topic around how do you build them, how do you represent them, how do we do thousands of them like that without doing every single one individually, because they're all bespoke, they're all different, and that kind of thing. So yeah, that's potentially a limitation that is something that, again, can be looked at in the future as these kind of top projects progress.
Super. And one final question, and I think we'll have to call it a day, folks, but how did you work out the socio-economic cost benefit? Okay,
so we used a combination of the best tool and a few other bespoke approaches to calculate it. So one of the reasons why we elected to try and derive those footprints for SuDS, so if you remember the diagram with all the footprints there, it's because that gives us a bit more of a tangible understanding of the actual area that the SuDS may take up. So not just the counter features, but the area. So as you might imagine, some pavements are huge and you can fit reasonably substantial features in there if you could do length, and then you get plenty of sort of more residential areas where you get the occasional little corner across, at a crossroads, and those little bits you can fit in. So and the best tool works with unit cost or unit benefits. So by doing that, we can actually calculate unit benefit. We can actually use the unit benefits to calculate up the net benefit for different scenarios and for the optimal scenarios again. So the optimal ones might have different types of features. They have different volumes of benefit. But yeah, we largely use the best tool to calculate a number of, I can't remember what it was now, I think it's 11 different benefits. And we also added a few others like the urban heat island effect and land value. And there's a few other minor ones like that. And as I said, natural capital is a huge topic in itself. So we relied on our internal natural capital team a little bit to give us some steer and guidance on that one. But I mean, and obviously I welcome plenty of new developments and developments around that piece, because there isn't one answer to that one.
Excellent. So thank you, Simon. I really appreciate it, and thanks to everyone for your questions. We will have to do a sort of subsequent FAQ for you because there are too many questions to ask. We need another hour or two just to go through that, but that was great. And I'll hand you over back to Ben. Thank you, Simon. Thanks, Ian. And over to you, Ben.
Yeah, what a great start to our virtual event program this year. Big thanks to Simon for a fantastic presentation and answering the questions today, and to Peter for hosting the webinar. As Peter said, if we didn't get a chance to answer your question today, we promised to get back to you with an answer. I'll be updating you with a recording of this webinar next week and revealing details of our next event. Please also remember to take 2 minutes to complete the short survey that follows this webinar. Your feedback is important to us, and in return you'll receive an attendance certificate for use for your CPD. As always, don't forget to check out our upcoming training courses. Visit our website for more details about them. And finally, thank you for joining us today, and we hope you have a great day, everyone.